Okay, hi, it's almost time to start. For those of you who are watching us live on YouTube, we're really happy you're there watching from YouTube. And for those of you who are here in the live webinar, we are absolutely thrilled to have you as well. So let's give a big wave to everybody who's participating in the live conference. Thank you so much. And we have a bunch of you who are just turning on your cameras, and that's good because we have a really lively interactive session for tonight. So we're just going to give it one more minute. We're going to be asking you about where you're calling from and why you're participating, and then we'll really be off for, I think, what's going to be a really great example of a best practices session, or at least as close to a best practices session as we have in media literacy. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hi, my name is Renee Hobbs, and welcome to tonight's session, How Media Literacy Handles Distorted Science. Tonight, we're tackling the convergence of disinformation, climate science, and media literacy. And we're very fortunate to have with us Chris Barrie, the Director of Curriculum and Staff Development at Project Looksharp. You can see from the front end that we're going to tackle some thorny problems that are really relevant to the teaching of media literacy today. Questions like, what are the boundaries, cautions, and considerations in using false or deceptive science in media literacy lessons intended to teach students to develop more complex capacities to analyze, identify, and evaluate truth? Do we risk perpetuating false dichotomies when we decode opposing sides in debates such as climate change or vaccines? And finally, how do we let students decide what to believe when the science is clear and imperative? And how do we simultaneously teach critical thinking and protect the science? So we're so happy that you're here, and we want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to us. So give me a thumbs up if you've used the annotation function of Zoom before. No, so some of you are annotation virgins. Ah, that's wonderful. Zoom has a really cool feature called annotation. And if you scroll your screen up at the top, if you move your cursor up to the top, you're going to see an annotation button. And so if you can just use the stamp function, just highlight the stamp function, and you could put a little star or question mark or symbol where you are on the map. So try to practice with that and see what you think of it. It's kind of cool. There's a star from Brazil. Can you introduce yourself while you're putting your stamp and tell us a little bit about yourself, please? If you're just joining us, we invite you to try out the annotation function, put a star on the map for where you're located, and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Cristiane Parente. I'm from Brazil, Brasília, the capital. And I'm a researcher and also eternal student of media literacy. I have been studying and working with media literacy since 1999. So it's a pleasure. It's really good to be here with you.
Wonderful. I see a star from Russia. Will you introduce yourself, please? See the star up there? Well, I see quite a few stars from North America. Can I get some of the North Americans to introduce yourself, please?
I'm from Philadelphia.
And what's your name?
I'm Ruth Bakenbaum, and I'm the Teaching and Learning Center coordinator at William Penn Charter School.
Wonderful, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Who else is going to introduce themselves?
I'm Phyllis. I'm just below Ruth. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. I leave that an open statement. I also work in Rwanda for a term every year, and I'm on faculty at Johns Hopkins with the Teach for America program.
Wonderful, welcome.
That feels like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Barrie, I'm Chris's brother in Ithaca, write curriculum for Project Look Sharp, and really thanking you, Renee, for all the great media literacy education you're bringing to all of us all these years. Thank you.
We're happy you're here. Who else is joining us tonight?
Hi, I'm Emily from upstate New York, and I'm finishing up my master's thesis at RIT in Rochester. So I'm excited to be here. I'm procrastinating finishing my edits.
Welcome to you, Emily. Who else is introducing themselves tonight?
Hi, Renee. I'm Mariana. I put the star in the middle of the Atlantic, so I guess stamping is not my forte, really. But I'm from Brazil. I'm currently in São Paulo, and I'm one of the coordinators of Educa Media, our media literacy program, and we're very happy to be here because there's never been a more important time to talk about news literacy and science.
We are delighted that you're here, and while we're getting the Brazilians introduced, Dominique, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. So I'm Dominique. I'm a media teacher here in Brazil, near São Paulo.
Welcome. And while we're introducing the Brazilians, let's say hello to Patricia. Patricia, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Renee. Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia from Palavra Aberta, an Institute of Media Literacy and Freedom of Expression. So I'm very delighted to be here and see every one of you. And hi, Renee, I miss you.
We're so happy you're here. And so Mariana Lopez, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Mariana. I'm from Brazil. I'm a professor at University of Brasilia and also a researcher in media education field. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Spencer Brayton, will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Spencer Brayton. I'm a librarian at a community college about 45 minutes west of Chicago.
Welcome. And David Rhodes, will you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, yeah, I'm David. I'm in the Boston area, and I'm currently studying education policy and management at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I used to live in upstate New York in Ithaca, and I've learned from and with Project Look Sharp over years, going back to the very beginning of my teaching social studies 7 years ago.
Awesome. We're glad you're here. Stephanie, will you introduce yourself to us, please?
Sure, yeah. Stephanie Flores Coolish here from Baltimore. Get the, whoops, this side. There's the Orioles hat. And I'm a faculty member at Loyola University, Maryland, and I teach teachers there and run a program called Curriculum and Instruction for Social Justice. And I'm a former student of Renee's from a few years ago.
We're glad you're here. Victor, welcome. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Victor. I'm from Brasilia, Brazil, and I'm a bilingual teacher. I teach kids from like 6 years old till adults. I work with a bilingual school, but focused on teaching language. So yeah, pretty excited to be here. Thank you.
We are super glad you're joining us. So we've got quite a powerful brain trust of media literacy thought leaders here in this room. And that is going to make tonight especially lively and interesting. Now, for our non-video participants, we welcome you to introduce yourself on the chat room, because as you can see, we have gathered from at least 3 continents, right? And we are really happy to learn from our friend Chris Barrie. Chris, take it away, buddy.
Great, very exciting to be here. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Sure.
First of all, I had no idea we would have the Brazil connection that we do. That's very exciting. We're not going to speak to this, but we just got a grant to train teachers across Panama and I know different language, but to integrate media literacy into the teaching of English language instruction. So we'd love to connect with folks in Latin America, Brazil, around those kinds of issues. But tonight's focus is going to be on juicy issues having to do with science. I have been with Project Look Sharp since the beginning, founded by Dr. Cindy Scheib, who may be checking in at some point back in the 90s. I started my work in media literacy. I had actually an undergraduate major in 1979 from Ithaca College in media literacy, using the work of Paulo Freire, speaking of Brazil, and critical consciousness for teaching students to decode the world through all different forms of media production and media analysis. And I've been working with Cindy and with my brother Sox since the mid-90s at Project Look Sharp. And our work is to fill the niche in media literacy to support the educators who want to teach, need to teach critical thinking about media, but feel overwhelmed with the content subject area requirements. For instance, high school social studies, I've got to teach the history of the world, in a year, or American history, or science. I've got to teach them what they know about biology or health. So what we have created over the years is resources to support those teachers to teach their core standards, their core content knowledge in endocrine disruptors and high school biology, but to do it using the repurposing of rich media documents to have students ask questions around the messages, the meanings, to apply their knowledge, and to think critically about sourcing and accuracy, about interpretation, about impact and effects. So to constantly be reading their world, but to have that happen from kindergarten through college in all different subject areas by giving teachers the resources and materials to apply what we call constructivist media decoding to their curriculum. So we have over 450 lessons by different subject areas, by different grade levels. And a lot of those lessons relate to issues of science. Many of them are in this kit, which is more than 10 years old now, Media Construction of Global Warming, that teach both core science and critical thinking about the media. And a little more than a month ago, one of the teachers that we were working with said, I have a problem with some of the materials. She was a college professor, activist in science, particularly working with issues of climate change. And she said, I think some of your materials inappropriate and can do damage, can do harm. So we were all ears about that. And we pulled together what we call a charrette. Charrette is a term that comes from architecture. When you're early on in the process of getting people to think about ideas of an upcoming project, you bring together all different minds with a very open-ended thinking. So we decided to bring together activists and elementary, secondary, college level science teachers for an evening to help us think about, are we doing damage? Are there unintended consequences of this work? And in order to frame it, I'm going to show you just 1 minute from a video clip. We have a series of videos. You could pull that back up, Renee, if you would, the PowerPoint. We have a series of videos online that are 5 to 10 minutes demonstrating media decoding, different subject areas, different grade levels. I'm just going to show you the opening minute of one of the lessons which was at the heart of this conflict, and then go on to talk about that conflict and where that group kind of came to over the evening. So Renee, if you'll play just that first minute of this.
Let me know if you can hear it.
I'm going to play a short clip from this film called The Great Global Warming Swindle, which challenges the position that it's human contributions to CO2 that cause climate change. I want you to think about what the key messages are in this clip about global warming and the role of anthropogenic human-caused CO2. And I also want you to take a look simultaneously about the kind of techniques the filmmakers are using to communicate their messages.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans.
Okay, just a short clip. What are the key messages in that little 30 seconds that you saw about anthropogenic CO2? So Renee will probably hold it there. Great. So I wanted to frame that because one of the first critiques is the first bullet point, Renee, and that is that media documents like that risk perpetuating lies. That you may have picked up. It was a climate denial video, part of a larger documentary. I don't tell students that, but I do a series of probing. You can watch over the 11 minutes or a number of other documents we look at and analyze. You can find that on our website under media decoding videos and examples. But we felt that the video really demonstrated a way of engaging students around core content, around, in this case, the carbon cycle and issues of equilibrium, to understand the ways in which this video, The Great Global Warming Swindle, was manipulating information in science to communicate an erroneous assumption or understanding of science. What some of the professors and activists said is that document, that media message risks perpetuating those lies, and that while you may be doing a good job there with those students who seem prepared, teachers aren't necessarily prepared to do that. And you risk doing harm by putting these materials out into the world. Next one. That the framing of the lessons is absolutely critical, and you need to do all that you can to ensure that teachers are using this appropriately. Fourth, that questions are often used by those in positions of power and authority in industry and in politics to obfuscate, to promote a sense of doubt when the science is clear. Number 5, the science is clear. We just need to tell students what the truth is about the science and not confuse them or potentially promote doubt and unintended maybe to perpetuate the views and ideas of those in power who want to maintain, in this case, the fossil fuel industry. And that number 6, above all, we must protect the science, that is the highest priority. So I'm hoping that we might engage in conversation about this, but for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm gonna lay out some of the rest of the conversation and where it's come for Project Look Sharp in our work. So next slide, the agreements that also came out of that charrette, in addition to those critiques by some folks, was that, you know what, we must teach students to decode the propaganda, that it's out there in the world, it's being seen by the students, we can't ignore it. We must give them the skills and the knowledge, the habits, and the ability to critique and analyze, that just telling them the truth is not enough. And what really convinced some of the folks, including, I think, what swayed some of the scientists who felt most strongly about just telling the truth, is our growing knowledge, the third one down, that truth is no longer, never has been, something that just gets laid out. You know, that if we just tell them in the classroom what the facts are, that they'll understand. So much research is showing us that, particularly for students who already have opinions, that their motivated reasoning is so strong that they can take the facts that are presented and they can come up with other facts that will counter that to confirm what they believe, to discredit the sources that don't fit with their belief system, to bring forward the sources and the facts that do confirm their belief system. So knowledge doesn't necessarily armor one to discover the truth unless, and this is where the research of Kahn and Boyer is so important, studying what are the media literacy techniques and strategies that have been most effective in helping students find truth in political contexts. And that is if you can teach students to be reflective on their own biases, their own confirmation biases, then the students who have the strongest motivation to reinforce their perspective can learn very quickly to be onto their own thinking. So that's going to be a real focus of some of the ideas that I'm bringing forward here today. So the group did agree that we must protect the science and avoid unintentionally perpetuating misinformation and distortion and lies, but that we must also teach media literacy. So that's this next set of bullet points that I want to bring forward about how to do that. You'll recognize bullet point 1 and 2 quite readily from media literacy. To understand propaganda, what are the techniques that are used, what are the different groups that are presenting information, what are the tactics of spin, classic media literacy. To understand the biases within the media, the desire for false dichotomies or didactic polarization that brings drama. And even if the science is clear that 99% of scientists, climate scientists, believe that it's anthropogenic, if you can just have two people from opposing sides, it sells more eyeballs for the advertising and is more exciting. Or if you can create drama, it will pull more people. That's part of the biases of the media. Or to emphasize fear and uncertainty and doubt fuels eyeballs on the media and the advertising. So to understand those biases. But thirdly, the piece I was speaking to before, that media literacy must focus on the fourth key concept of media analysis, which is that we interpret media through our own lenses, through our own identities, through our own experiences. We have myriad examples of that. So we can't just focus on the media message. We need to focus on the reception of that message, the interpretations, the understanding of that message, and help students to be metacognitive, to reflect on their own thinking. Number 4, asking the right questions. And this was an interesting one. Faith Rogo was a member of the charrette. And she said, it's not just about asking questions. Asking questions does have the risk of just perpetuating doubt. That's often what those in power want, is for people to ask lots of questions and to blur what some of the core issues are. But asking the right questions is different. Being an interrogator is not just being a skeptic. It's knowing what kinds of questions to ask. And of course, that varies with what our classes are, who our students are, what their understanding is. But I think that idea of right questions is an important one for us to be thinking about. And then the next 2 really got to issues of science, that it was important from the perspective of the science educators to distinguish the science and maybe the debate about science, or the lack of debate about science. There is no debate about climate change being anthropogenic and human caused. And to make that clear, there are other debates within the sciences about the best ways to approach that and to mitigate but there's social debate, there's political debate about that. There's no scientific debate pretty much about evolution, but there is religious perspectives and points of view. So to distinguish those within the science classroom. And then 6th is, for me, really interesting, because I'm just starting to get my mind around this one, which is to recognize and name the limits of our scientific understanding. We had scientists there when we got into issues having to do with GMOs and others that said, it is so complex, we still don't fully understand. So how do we work with students, elementary, middle, high school students, and have them understand scientific concepts that we're still struggling with? So the one thing that came out of this is to name that, to be overt about, we don't fully understand. There are limits to our understanding of this, as opposed to science being something that's supposed to be, we understand all of that. And it ties to the last one, which is to really try to negotiate and help our students negotiate ambiguity and to embrace complexity. It's a powerful moment for us to be meeting in terms of ambiguity and the anxiety of not knowing things about the future and to help our students to be able to move towards greater complexity and to resist the temptation for simple answers. So the last piece that I'll share is a piece that I think media literacy not only can, but needs to bring to all education, and maybe science education, social studies education. I do a lot of work in those knowledge, content-oriented fields in particular, that have a great pressure to get the information to students. And I've taught history for 40 years at the middle school and high school level. And I think historical knowledge is the fuel of thinking. But I wish I could fill my students up. Just, I know it doesn't work. No matter how much time and energy we spend, when I listen back to how students have understand what I'm saying, I want to tear my hair out sometimes. And I know that learning is constructivist. Next one, if you would, Renee. And that is that it is based on students' meaning making. It is based on how they understand what we're teaching them. And the beauty of being a teacher with our students and knowing our students, and it's a powerful moment in time in terms of what it means to know your students when you're only seeing them digitally, and through distance. But we pick up all sorts of ways of how our students are understanding the world. And face-to-face, it's easier to see body language and to smell their meaning making, to see how they're interacting with each other, to probe with questions. But we can do that in the digital world through chat boxes and through journals. We can listen to how they understand media, how they understand our teaching of them. And as we move forward in crafting media documents about what I'll call controversial science, it's not necessarily contested in the science, but maybe contested in the political arena or religious or social or cultural, that we need to be listening to their meaning making. And we need to choose, whether it's elementary, middle, high school, college, we need to choose the documents that will help us to achieve our goals of having our students think in more complex ways. We need to pick media documents and choose questions and to probe where our students have disequilibrium in their understanding, where they're at the cusp of understanding something. And we can help them move forward by having them talk with each other in dialogue, choosing students who have a little more complex way of explaining to other students and have them talk back and forth around these issues. We need to frame our lessons in a way that will get at these deeper understandings. We don't tell students what to mean, what to think, we don't construct their analysis for them, but we choose the documents, we choose the questions, we probe with them, and we can frame and follow up afterwards their understanding. So we're ultimately helping them not to come to the right conclusion, but to think in more complex and more critical, more compassionate, and more understanding ways about the world. And then ultimately always evaluating how that worked, doing it again in different ways. So that's my little less than 20 minutes, I think, of introduction to the kind of issues that came up and that we're working with, obviously, around not just science issues. Today we had a little gathering of Look Sharp folks around politics and Trump and Biden and advertisements and doing no harm when presenting false narratives created by political parties, and the incredible importance of this moment, but to also hold to our principles and our beliefs that education, the Enlightenment, critical thinking is at the core of the future and democracy. And I'm conscious of speaking to folks in Brazil and other places around the world who are, I know, struggling. I've been spending time in Turkey, struggling with these issues. So thank you for the work that you're all doing, Baltimore and everywhere else.
Okay, so Chris, we're going to invite the folks who are on the call, if you're on the video or if you're not on the video, to make a comment, to react, to share your interpretation of this complex set of issues. If you haven't yet discovered how to use what I call the Brady Bunch feature, it's up there in the right-hand corner. You can toggle back and forth to see all of the people who've chosen to put their video screens on. But I know you have opinions about this topic because that's why you're here tonight. So who wants to get started? Who wants to kick it off?
I think I can. I remember, for example, something that is really important, and I think it's what Chris wants to tell us. When he talks, I remember about active methodologies. They are not new. If we think in all educators, for example, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Vygotsky, Piaget, all of them worked with this point of view of the importance of listening to the students and help them to construct their own knowledge. So I think we have to take these active methodologies also to teach media literacy. We can separate this active methodologies for school and media literacy in another way. I think we have to work nowadays with most and in every moment with active methodologies and put the students at the center of this process of construction knowledge.
Thank you for sharing. Who's next?
I think I can say something. First of all, thank you, Chris, so much for the reflections, very provocative thoughts. And I think you'd like to know that, you know, we met Cindy at NAMLE last year, and we have been using the Look Sharp questions all over Brazil now. So, you know, those materials are getting to be quite well known here, we hope. And as we prepare lesson plans for teachers and we try to help teachers bring these issues to their own classrooms, one of the things I always struggle with is choosing the right documents. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's so important to find documents to compare that are not going to show our own bias right off the bat, and find something that's not going to be a caricature and are going to be, you know, equally convincing, that will prompt the students to have a real deep reflection and have to go into deep analysis. And that's one thing. And the other thing is, it's the other fine line that I find myself talking here is, how do we do all this without feeling this general sense of distrust, you know, when it's so important to build trust in the media, and it's so needed right now. So these are the issues that we've been grappling with over here.
Thanks for sharing. Who wants to chime in on this? I'm a little concerned that the scientists that you encountered were so fearful of kids' misinterpretation. That freaked me out. And I feel like in some ways, this is an interesting tension that exists between media literacy educators and what you described as kind of content heavy or transmission oriented educators. Because when I ask critical questions, it's because I genuinely want kids to figure it out for themselves. And that means I'm okay with wherever they are on that process. And I don't feel the need to control their interpretation. But obviously the science teachers do feel the need to control kids' interpretations, to give them the right interpretations. So part of me thinks we're just fundamentally have different purposes for what we're, and different goals. And maybe these are irreconcilable.
Let me pose back to you. Is that really true, that you're always open to just hearing genuinely students' opinions? And so if a student were in the middle of your class to present I'll take an extreme version, a very racist perspective and point of view, would you not feel the need to challenge that? And you would just keep that open-ended, even if there were vulnerable students, and you could pick any number of issues in that room that would be harmed by that opinion, and you're the adult, you're the person in the room. Do you have a responsibility to intervene, or is it just whatever opinion and perspective, it's okay?
Wow. You know, I guess I've always been able to count on the other learners in the room to do that work. So I haven't had to, because it's a truly democratic space. So I guess I haven't been faced that paradox, but maybe that's what's motivating these science teachers, is that's what they've experienced and it scares them.
Terrifies them. They're feeling that the state of the planet, when we're talking about climate change and climate denial, is at stake. And for them to allow a conversation that it explores and have students think, no, you know what, maybe it is not anthropogenic. That is threatening to both their identity and ideology, but also their sense of the safety of the planet. The same way that in an elementary school class, if one student says a certain thing, I can't rely on the other elementary school students to respond to that student. So I see it a little differently, that I think they have a legitimate concern, but that doesn't mean that I agree with that concern. Others want to weigh in on that?
Renee, could you model a little bit for us how you would prompt the democratic conversations? Because like Chris, I have certainly come across this where it is an absolute silence, and I feel I need to step up as a teaching moment and talk about embedded stereotypes and how we need to express understanding of others in a way that maybe isn't comfortable. I don't always find my students want to go to those conversations. Do you have some kind of hints for us?
One thing that I think is really interesting that has come up in my own classroom is to honor the perception that my students have that they can't speak their mind in the classroom because there is a politically correct answer. My students want to talk about that. They want to say that they want me to validate the fact that when they come into some classrooms, there are certain things they cannot say. There are certain opinions they cannot have. There are certain topics that are off the table because they've been socialized by other teachers to what they should say. And I feel like the fact that kids are hungry to talk about that is something that I have to honor, even though it makes me really uncomfortable because it means I'm part of the problem. But their perception that that is a real form of restricting expression that is undemocratic, their belief that that is undemocratic is something I want to honor, even when I disagree with it.
Others on this rich issue?
I'll jump in.
I remember Socrates. No, you can tell. You can say.
Faith and then Christian.
No, it's just I remember the philosopher Socrates and his way of teaching the students with lots of questions and questions and questions. And in the beginning, the students, oh, okay, now we arrived in the right point. But then Socrates continued the questions and the questions, and then the students, oh, okay, now I'm in doubt. I'm not sure if this is the right way. So this kind of situation, we can put the students to have some doubts about their what they really think that it's right, and then try to show them another point of view of another students, and then all of the how the way they were secure. Okay, we have another point of views, and I'm not so so secure about my opinion. I remember Socrates is an interesting point of view to our class.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of along a similar vein. I mean, for me, it's always about distinguishing between teaching content and teaching inquiry. And that if the focus is on the inquiry and the kinds of probing that you're doing, the kinds of questions that you're asking, then it doesn't become about, well, what's your final opinion? It's about how strong is your evidence and where are you getting your evidence from? And, are you asking questions that are probative, or are you asking questions that like the scientists were, worried that industry often uses these uses questioning to sow doubt in people. And, there's a real difference between sowing doubt as the goal and interrogation of a text as the goal. And those produce very different kinds of questions. And to me, it's about pointing out to students that difference. That would never, for me at least, stop me from calling a halt, or at least calling a student on something they said that was racist or homophobic, or in some other way creating unsafe space for other people in the room.
I like that clarity, Faith.
I think I have some things to talk about, because I work as I work with kids, we see a lot, right? Teenagers as well. And when my students are a bit older, the first thing I ask, and this is really common to see, because in front of us, at least in front of me, they tend not to speak such things. But when we pass by and they're like in the hallways talking to their friends, they tend to perpetuate certain behaviors, let's say. And then once, I always ask them, why do you think the way you think? So why do you say what you're saying right now? What brought you to this opinion? What brought you here today thinking like that? And that turns something in their head. They stop and think like, oh, because my mom told so, or because my family does the same. They don't know where that opinion comes from. So not only it's nice for us to teach them, where to find the correct information. Where do you get your bias from? Like, they don't know what bias is. They don't know they have their own biases, they have no idea. So everything changes when they understand that it's not only the media that has a bias. It's not only other people's opinions that have a bias. You also have that responsibility. You need to understand where your opinions come from in order to grow and to expand, or to understand that if you want to grow or not, So that's a really nice questioning to ask. Like, the inquiry comes from that. Like, so why, right?
And actually, this isn't really about young people. My mom does it all the time. She doesn't know where her opinion comes from. And when I ask, she gets really angry with me.
How come?
What? Sorry?
Why did she get angry with you, do you think?
Because I start doing, asking this kind of questions. Why do you think of that? Where did this information came from? And she doesn't know how to answer. So she just say, I don't want to talk about it anymore, and change subjects.
One of the things I like to do is I like to model for my students how I change my mind. So sometimes that, and I liked how, Chris, you talked about how document selection is really important, right? And that there's a strategy to how you model that practice. So for me, the mantra is strong opinions, lightly held. I want to show my students how I might come in with a strong opinion, but when I read a compelling piece of information that gives me strong evidence and reasoning, and I change my mind, my strong opinion is lightly held and willing to be changed in light of new information. And so then I model that I'm just a work in progress, and whatever my opinions are now doesn't mean that's how I'll be tomorrow or next week or the month after that, because I am holding my opinions in relation to what I encounter in the world. And that's why we can't be angry or blame anybody if they've got distorted ideas, if they've got misinformation. It's really, that's where they are on the journey. And so
there's nothing wrong about it, right?
Well, I want to add to what Victor was saying and connect it to Renee's. In fact, it's not only just the evidence for us. I think all of us, we also have values and beliefs. So Renee, for you, the value of critical thinking is fundamental to teaching students to think for themselves. You could call it a bias. That's a bias that I hope we bring to all of the lessons that we create, but it's a value that we will stand behind So I think we also want to help students, as Victor, you were speaking to, we want to help them to recognize, and Dominique, for your mother to recognize, what are not only the evidence and the facts and the ideas, but what are the values, what are the beliefs, what are the identities that stand behind these ideas? Because often when it comes to politics today in the United States, it's about identity and threat and fear as much, or if not more, than it's about facts. But if we can get students to recognize what the motivation is behind their thinking, and that isn't easy. We have to continually be asking not only where does that come from, but how does it relate to your gender? How does it relate to whether you're right now, the conversations I have with people about COVID-19, are you in New York City or are you in upstate New York? Pretty different experiences, in terms of where people are at. So your geography, your age, your cohort, but to help students continually be thinking about their meaning making, that it is constructed not only by the media, but by their own backgrounds, and to be conscious and aware. And that's part of what I heard in Victor speaking to in terms of that critical consciousness, and Dominique wanting to push her mom on in terms of thinking in a more complex way.
Thanks for sharing other perspectives.
So I have a quick question, maybe discussion point. So all the fake images that have been coming out, images have been kind of my specialty lately, of like the swans coming back to Venice, all of those things that are like, do support the climate change is real and caused by humans, but are misplaced images, miscaptioned images. They're feel-good images like, look, there's no smog in LA today, or whatever. Some images of that change are real. Some of those images of that change are like actual photographs, but not well placed and published. So how do you create discussion around that with your students?
Great question. What are photographs as evidence? How do you understand photos as evidence? How do you teach about photos as evidence? Wow, especially in the context of science. Cool question.
And I want to jump in just from the Look-Sharp perspective. Sachs, you could jump in as well, that we always want to say one of the first questions you're going to have with any great document, the swans coming back to Venice, is what are your objectives in this lesson activity? And if it is, as Renee suggested, to really focus on evidence-based analysis, there'd be a different set of questions you would pose than if you're trying to get them, let's say, stick with this idea of my own identities. How do I respond emotionally, spiritually to that image? What's resonating? What do I want that image to speak to? That's kind of a different objective to be able to get it. And I would have a different set of questions around that than I would. And of course, if my kids were elementary age or college, there'd be a different potential set of questions. So you've got a wonderful document to play with. What are your objectives? What are you trying to get them to understand? What are your students ready to understand about their own relationship to that, or about evidence-based analysis? And what questions could you pose that group that you're working with could really run with and would take them to the next level of understanding?
I wanted to circle back to something that Faith said that really struck me. I wrote it down, that sowing doubt is very different from interrogating information. And that is so important because it has to do with creating this bias towards learning as opposed to doubting. So when you talk about your willingness to change your position because you're willing to learn, is very important. So I always think about how we can think of strategies to encourage one thing and not the other. So thank you, Faith, for that instantly quotable phrase.
Yeah, of course, diagnosing questions is also a good way to recognize propaganda too, right? Because questions have purposes. So when a question's purpose is to attack, that's a different purpose than when the question's purpose is to discover, right? So analyzing questions, thinking about what's the motive of the person who asks the question, and to play with that a little bit, right? Because actually we can play with asking mean and hateful questions that right, that sabotage and that trivialize and that diminish, we can learn to play with that so we can recognize them when we see them in the news, on the TV, and in the mouth of our president.
Faith, can you speak a little bit to what you meant by, I think it was your quote, asking the right question, certainly, but what it means to be a good interrogator?
Well, I mean, obviously this is really complex, and it very much, to me, is always organic depending on what it is you're teaching. And Chris, what you were talking about with, what's your goal for introducing this document in the first place? And that somebody who's introducing a document in the context of a media production class might have a very different set of goals for discussing that document than somebody doing it in social studies, or somebody doing it in an English literature class, or, so I would always ground it in kind of, what the goals are. But I would go back, actually, I think so much of this goes back to kind of the very basics of what media literacy questioning has always been. And that if you start with these open-ended probes, you'll get to the, is this real or fake, pretty quickly. And they'll get there on their own. It doesn't have to be us lecturing. If you start with, so what is this? What are we looking at here? Where did it come from? Who made it? What are the possible reasons that they made it? Why did they make these particular choices? What do you notice first? What draws your attention to that? All those kinds of really general opening prompts. And of course, the more that students are skilled at that, the more sophisticated the prompts can get. For me, actually, so that's my answer to that. My question often comes, and I think this came up with the scientists too, is that how well you're able to dissect a document requires some kind of background knowledge. I happen to be working in early childhood right now, and on early childhood stuff, and the assumption there is that they basically have almost no background, right? That there's, a 4-year-old's view of the world is very circumscribed. In more sophisticated analysis, you have, or you can presume, certain kinds of knowledge about science or the world or what's happening in politics today, or, things like that. And so I guess what I would do would be to separate out some of those lessons and that knowledge, and maybe just remind of, okay, so here's what we've learned about this historical period so far, and then bring in the document and just kind of remind them of, okay, so how does this relate? How does what apply to this? And that's kind of, I think, harder to teach teachers to do. Renee, you're muted.
So, I was just going to build on that point. I thought that was a really great point, Faith. And I was going to say, Chris, one of the bullet points that you called out in your talk was this idea, like, if you use a controversial text, like that has lies or falsehoods in it, right? Or is racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever. And the bullet point was, well, teachers won't know how to handle this kind of controversial text. Teachers don't have the skills to be able to manage that kind of dialogue. And of course, for me, teaching about propaganda, I also really want to be aware of not do no harm. That's the doctor's prescription, right? First, do no harm. So I'm very cautious about what kind of harmful propaganda I bring into my classroom, because I'm aware that I cannot control students' interpretations, right? And so I don't want to be responsible for exacerbating their false understandings of the world through me sharing dangerous propaganda, even when I try to deconstruct it. So I feel like the tension there around selecting materials that, like you made like a visual metaphor, like destabilizing, but not off the cliff. I think it's partly why curriculum design is such an art, right? And of course, I've been finding that from my students, the most destabilizing stuff they can see is foreign propaganda from other countries, right? So for instance, when the Brazilians shared with me the parody of political advertising, even though my students don't speak Portuguese, they could see very clearly how Portuguese politicians use many of the same kinds of silly stereotypes trying to get elected as ours do, right? And somehow the distance, the fact that it was foreign propaganda made it easier for my students to ask questions. It was easier for them to be ignorant, actually, because they're not expected to know anything about Brazilian politics. Whereas when I show them a text where they're going to look like an idiot if they ask a real question that they don't know the answer to, because like Faith said, and like Chris said, background knowledge is so foundational to how we make sense of and interpret and share meaning.
So one of the things that's striking home to me so clearly is that we could design the best curriculum in the world, but it is the art of teaching that will make that curriculum work or not work. It's the teacher knowing her students well, knowing where to push, where to probe, which documents they're going to pull from our curriculum, how to go with it to address so many of the things we've talked about. And we cannot separate the lessons from the methodology. You know, it's all part of the pedagogy, and it needs to be rooted in liberation, critical thinking, do no harm, our students' ages and identities and capabilities, the safety or lack thereof in that classroom, and I could go on and on. And we can't make curriculum, as some of the science teachers or science folks were saying, that protects students from the teachers. But we also need to be conscious of how do we support teachers, train, give them the background, the framing that they need in order to do the best job possible. So it's a big ask.
For sharing that. Phyllis, you made a really interesting observation in the chat room. Will you share it with us?
Thank you. I feel my world is so different. I was evacuated from Rwanda a few weeks ago in a place where if I, in a biology class, even use the term gender identities as a plural or spectrum, kids wouldn't know, teachers wouldn't know where to go. The idea of having text is curriculum. We don't have text. The content is delivered by the teacher. It's written on a blackboard from left to right, and the kids are copying. So the gap between where you all are and where I have just recently been is a little awesome today, which means that yanks me back to my area, which is equity, when we know that 60% of the kids in Baltimore schools are not getting 2 meals a day. So, you know, who cares about online learning? Sorry to yank it to reality. I do have a sense of humor. It's just, yeah, it's a little edgy right now. And I'm also struggling with a part of the world where the language of instruction is English, and yet only the very elite kids have access to that. And it means that some of the complexity of the language that Chris and Renee have used, I have to literally translate everything you say and use my hands and turn it into theater and role play. But I do it along with about 25 super teachers.
Cool.
I mean, we might have to start with the world is flat, but okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Phyllis.
Wow, that was powerful. We have just a few minutes left, and I'd love to invite the non-video participants to chime in with a comment, a question, a musing, a wonder. All right, Chris, well, I guess I'll give you the last word then. In some ways, embedded in the talk tonight was a problem and a solution. Can you state that problem as solution as crisply as you can, and let us go out thinking about how in our small ways we are part of the solution?
Well, maybe I'll try to transition from Phyllis's wonderful kind of bringing back to a certain kind of reality. I'm conscious of Stephanie there. My daughter's a vice principal in West Baltimore, just dealing right now with getting food to kids. And in whatever context we're in, we want to do right by our kids. And that's true for the media literacy work as well. And there's a courage with confronting the complexity of that. How do we do that with 4-year-olds, Faith? How do we do that with young people in Rwanda with a chalkboard, Phyllis? How do we do that when we're struggling with just getting food to our kids? And I think we'll find ways if we're grounded in those fundamental goals. I'll end with a story from Turkey. I think it was about 1.5 years ago, presenting to a group of 80 teacher trainers and teachers in Istanbul. Very engaging, but I was leading it all around decoding and analysis. And finally, after an hour or so, I just stopped and said, opened it up for questions. And a man jumped up from the side and said, I don't know what this guy is saying. If we do what he's talking about, we'll lose our jobs, if not get arrested. And there was silence, in the room. And then a woman teacher jumped up from the other side and said, well, if we don't teach students to ask questions about the world, what are we doing? That is fundamental to why we're all here as educators and what we're doing. And then all hell broke loose. And for the next 45 minutes, I didn't say a word, just listening to all of them go at it. For those teachers, the challenges were at a level that I don't experience, a level of risk and challenge. But on some level, we're all doing the same kind of work and trying to figure out how to help our kids see the world in more complex, compassionate, and truthful ways. And there's no one way to do that.
Wow. Let's give Chris Barrie a big round of applause for that. Marvelous, marvelous. Thank you for leading us tonight. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. We're happy that you were able to be part of the Media Education Lab community. Join us for another webinar in about a week or so. Thanks again for being part of our community. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Renee. Good to see you. Mwah, mwah. And Mariana from Brazil, so good to see you.
Good night.